March 15, 1943. A mud-soaked valley in eastern Tennessee. Gladys Owens, a 19-year-old farm girl from Sweetwater, stepped off a dusty bus and stared at what she had been told was a government facility. Before her stretched miles of wooden barracks, construction trailers, and massive buildings rising from red clay like industrial cathedrals. Armed guards stood at every checkpoint. Barbed wire fences disappeared into the fog-shrouded hills. She had no idea that this place, this secret city that didn't appear on any map, was about to become the most expensive, most ambitious, and most closely guarded industrial project in human history. She didn't know that within 6 months, she would be operating machinery so sophisticated that even the scientists who designed it barely understood how it worked. And she certainly had no idea that her work, repeated by thousands of other young women just like her, would separate uranium atom by atom, isotope by isotope, until they had created the core of the world's first atomic weapon. The letter that brought Gladys to Tennessee had been deliberately vague. Clinton Engineer Works seeks female operators for precision equipment, good pay, government work, patriotic duty. No mention of location, no description of the work, just an address in Knoxville and a date to report. What Gladys Owens did not know, what no worker arriving at that remote Tennessee valley could have known, was that they were about to become part of the Manhattan Project's most technically challenging facility, a place where the laws of physics were pushed to their absolute limits, where American industrial might would attempt something that seemed impossible, to separate 2 isotopes of uranium so nearly identical that they differed by less than 1% in mass. The problem that brought 75,000 workers to this hidden valley began in a laboratory in Berlin, December 1938. German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann bombarded uranium with neutrons and discovered something that shocked the physics community. The uranium atoms split apart, releasing enormous energy. Within weeks, physicists worldwide realized the implications. If you could create a chain reaction, if splitting one uranium atom released neutrons that split more atoms, you could release energy on a scale previously unimaginable. But there was a problem so technically difficult that most scientists initially believed it would make atomic weapons impossible. Natural uranium consists of 2 isotopes, uranium-238, making up 99.3% of all uranium, and uranium-235, comprising just 0.7%. The 2 isotopes are chemically identical. They have the same number of protons, the same electron configuration, the same chemical properties. The only difference is 3 neutrons, 3 particles among 238 total, a difference of just 1.26% in mass. Yet that tiny difference determines everything. Uranium-235 can sustain a chain reaction. Uranium-238 cannot. To build an atomic weapon, you need uranium that is at least 80% U-235. Natural uranium is 0.7% U-235. The task facing American scientists was clear and seemed nearly impossible. Separate these 2 nearly identical isotopes atom by atom until you have accumulated enough pure U-235 to sustain a chain reaction. Dr. Ernest Lawrence, director of the radiation laboratory at Berkeley, believed he had the answer. Lawrence was already famous for inventing the cyclotron, the circular particle accelerator that had revolutionized nuclear physics. In 1941, as the Manhattan Project began organizing, Lawrence proposed adapting his cyclotron design to separate uranium isotopes. He called it the Calutron, California University Cyclotron. The principle was elegant. Uranium would be heated until it vaporized into a plasma. This plasma would be ionized, given an electrical charge, and then shot through a powerful magnetic field. The magnetic field would bend the path of the uranium ions. Heavier U-238 ions would bend slightly less than lighter U-235 ions. At the end of their curved trajectory, two collector pockets would catch the separated isotopes. In theory, it was simple physics. In practice, it was an engineering nightmare that would push American industrial capability beyond anything previously attempted. Colonel Kenneth Nichols, the Army engineer assigned to oversee construction, examined the site chosen for the uranium separation plant in October 1942. His notes, preserved in Manhattan Project archives, capture his immediate concern. The site is 59,000 acres of rough Tennessee hill country, bisected by ridges and valleys. No significant infrastructure, no rail lines, no power grid capable of supporting the electrical load we will require, no housing for workers, no roads adequate for heavy construction equipment. We're being asked to build the world's most sophisticated industrial facility in what is essentially wilderness. Yet the site had one overwhelming advantage: isolation. The Tennessee Valley was remote, surrounded by ridges that would hide construction from casual observation. The government could acquire the land quickly, relocating the 3,000 residents of scattered farms and small communities. And nearby Knoxville could provide a civilian labor force. Construction began in February 1943. What followed was one of the rapid industrial mobilizations in American history. William Considine, a construction foreman who had worked on major dam projects, arrived at the site in March 1943. His diary, donated to the Oak Ridge Historical Society decades later, documents his astonishment. "We are building a city from nothing, not expanding an existing town, literally creating a city where none existed. In 6 months, we erected 10,000 family houses, dormitories for 13,000 workers, cafeterias serving 30,000 meals daily, hospitals, fire stations, schools, shops, even a symphony orchestra hall, all while simultaneously constructing the largest industrial buildings I have ever seen." The main uranium separation facility, designated Y-12, would cover 268,000 square feet under one roof. The building required 40,000 tons of structural steel at a time when steel was desperately needed for tanks, ships, and aircraft. The concrete foundation consumed 200,000 cubic yards of concrete. Inside, workers installed miles of electrical wiring, cooling systems capable of removing tens of millions of BTUs of heat, and vacuum systems that had to maintain near-perfect vacuum across thousands of cubic feet of space. And this was just the building. Inside would go the Calutrons, 22,482 of them, arranged in massive oval tracks called racetracks. The Calutrons themselves represented engineering at the edge of impossibility. Each unit required magnets powerful enough to bend the path of uranium ions, traveling at tremendous velocities. The only way to generate magnetic fields of sufficient strength was to use electromagnets with copper coils. But by 1942, copper was desperately scarce. Every pound of copper was needed for shell casings, electrical wiring, and radio equipment. General Leslie Groves, military director of the Manhattan Project, found an unprecedented solution: borrow silver from the United States Treasury. In a meeting that has become legendary in Manhattan Project history, Groves approached the Treasury Department and requested copper. The Treasury official responded that the government had no copper, but they did have silver. Tons of silver sitting in vaults at West Point. Groves asked how much silver they could borrow. The answer? 13,540 tons. The silver, valued at $300 million in 1942 dollars, was transported under armed guard to factories where it was formed into electromagnetic coils. Each Calutron magnet contained hundreds of pounds of silver. After the war, every ounce would have to be recovered and returned to the Treasury.
The accountability system for this silver became one of the most stringent tracking systems ever implemented, with workers searched at shift changes and every scrap of material inventoried daily.
Margaret Hinton was a physics graduate from Cornell University. In early 1943, she received a vague recruitment letter offering important war work in Tennessee. She arrived at what would become Oak Ridge in April 1943 and was assigned to the Y-12 plant. Her memoir, published decades later, provides a rare insider's view of what the work actually entailed. They showed me to a control panel perhaps 20 feet long, covered with dials, gauges, switches, and indicator lights. A supervisor explained that I would monitor these instruments and adjust controls to keep various readings within specified ranges. I asked what the machine did. He said that information was classified. I asked what I was measuring. Classified. I asked what would happen if readings went out of range. He showed me a manual, 300 pages of procedures, and told me to study it. I was being asked to operate sophisticated equipment without knowing what it did, what it produced, or why it mattered. I had a physics degree, yet they treated me like a technician following a cookbook recipe. This was the fundamental paradox of Y-12. The Calutron operators needed to be intelligent enough to master complex procedures, attentive enough to monitor dozens of instruments simultaneously, and disciplined enough to follow protocols precisely. Yet they could not be told what they were actually doing. The security system at Oak Ridge was unlike anything previously implemented in American industry. The entire complex was divided into zones. Workers received badges that permitted access only to their specific work areas. Military police staffed every checkpoint. The perimeter was surrounded by fences, guard towers, and patrol roads. All mail was censored. Phone calls were monitored. Workers were forbidden from discussing their work with anyone, including family members and co-workers in different zones. Private Joseph Maldonado, an Army guard assigned to Y-12 in August 1943, described the security culture in a post-war interview. Nobody knew anything beyond their immediate job. The women operating the control panels didn't know what the machines produced. The maintenance workers didn't know what the machines were for. Even most supervisors only understood their specific section. The compartmentalization was absolute. The secrecy created an atmosphere of constant suspicion and rumor. Workers speculated endlessly. Some thought they were producing rocket fuel. Others believed it was poison gas. A few guessed they were working on some new kind of explosive. Almost none imagined the truth. They were separating uranium isotopes for an atomic weapon.
The challenge of operating Calutrons was immense. Each racetrack, called an alpha unit, contained 96 Calutrons arranged in an oval configuration. Uranium tetrachloride, a compound containing uranium, was heated to 180 degrees Celsius until it vaporized. The vapor was ionized by an electrical arc, creating uranium ions. These ions were accelerated to high velocities by electric fields exceeding 35,000 volts, then shot through the magnetic field. Everything had to be perfect. If the vacuum wasn't pure enough, ions would collide with stray molecules and scatter. If the magnetic field wasn't uniform, ions would follow irregular paths. If the temperature varied, the ionization rate would change. If the electrical fields fluctuated, ion velocities would be inconsistent. The operators, almost all young women, had to monitor these variables constantly and make micro-adjustments to keep the system in equilibrium. Helen Jernigan, who operated a Calutron panel from 1943 to 1945, recalled the intensity of the work. You watched dozens of gauges simultaneously. If one reading started to drift, you adjusted a control. But changing one variable affected others. You were constantly making tiny adjustments, trying to keep everything balanced. The work required complete concentration. A shift was 8 hours, but it felt like days. You emerged exhausted, knowing only that you had kept your panel within specified ranges. Whether that mattered, whether it contributed to anything important, we had no idea.
The scale of Y-12 was staggering. By December 1943, the facility was operating 864 Calutrons in alpha racetracks. But the output was disappointing. Each Calutron produced only minute quantities of enriched uranium daily. Calculations showed that even with all racetracks operating at maximum efficiency, it would take years to produce enough U-235 for a single weapon. The solution was to build even larger facilities. Beta racetracks, with 288 Calutrons each, were constructed to further enrich the partially enriched uranium from the alpha units. Eventually, Y-12 would contain 5 alpha racetracks and 3 beta racetracks, 22,482 Calutrons, making it the largest electromagnetic isotope separation facility ever built. The electrical consumption was almost incomprehensible. At peak operation, Y-12 consumed 238 megawatts of electrical power, more electricity than the entire city of New York. The Tennessee Valley Authority had to construct new dams and power plants specifically to supply Oak Ridge. Even with this capacity, the power demand was so enormous that Y-12 operations had to be coordinated with regional electrical grids to avoid brownouts across the southeastern United States. Dr. William Pollard, a physicist who worked at Oak Ridge, later analyzed the sheer improbability of what was accomplished. Consider what we were attempting. Natural uranium contains 0.7% U-235. We needed to concentrate it to 80% or higher. This meant we had to process approximately 114 kilograms of natural uranium to extract 1 kilogram of weapons-grade U-235. And we needed roughly 50 kilograms for a weapon. This meant processing 5,700 kilograms of uranium through machines that separated atoms individually. The Calutron process was monumentally inefficient by any industrial standard, yet it was the only method that actually worked at scale in 1943-1944.
The work was mentally exhausting. Operating a Calutron panel required 8 hours of intense concentration. The slightest distraction could cause readings to drift out of range. Operators were discouraged from talking, reading, or any activity that might divert attention from their instruments. Ruth Huddleston, who operated Calutrons for 2 years, recalled the psychological pressure. You couldn't know if you were doing good work. There was no feedback, no sense of accomplishment. You watched dials and adjusted controls for 8 hours, then went home and came back the next day and did it again. Some women broke down. They would start crying at their panels, unable to continue. Others became obsessed, checking and rechecking every reading, terrified of making a mistake. The only thing that kept most of us going was the repeated assurance that our work was essential to winning the war. By mid-1944, Y-12 was producing uranium at a rate that exceeded initial projections. The alpha racetracks were feeding partially enriched material to beta racetracks, which were producing uranium enriched to 80% U-235 or higher. Each day, a few grams more were added to the accumulating stockpile. Each week, the stockpile grew closer to the critical mass needed for a weapon. The improvements came from countless small optimizations. Operators learned to recognize subtle patterns in gauge readings that indicated optimal performance. Maintenance crews developed more efficient cleaning procedures. Engineers refined the magnetic field configurations. Scientists adjusted the operating temperatures and voltages. Nobody was told how close they were to the goal. Security prevented anyone from knowing the total output or how much was needed. The workers simply continued their tasks day after day, trusting that someone, somewhere, knew why it mattered.
August 6, 1945. At 8:15 a.m., the B-29 bomber Enola Gay released a weapon designated Little Boy over Hiroshima, Japan.
The bomb contained 64 kilograms of uranium enriched to approximately 80% U-235. Of this uranium, roughly 80% had been produced at Y-12 using Calutrons operated by young women who had no idea what they were creating. The detonation released energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. The blast, heat, and radiation killed an estimated 70,000 people immediately and another 70,000 in the following months. 3 days later, a plutonium implosion weapon destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15th, Japan announced its surrender, ending World War II. The announcement that an atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima left Oak Ridge workers stunned. For the first time, they understood what they had been building. The mysterious panels they had monitored, the instruments they had watched so carefully, the procedures they had followed so precisely. All of it had been to separate uranium atoms for the world's first atomic weapon. Helen Jernigan, the Calutron operator, recalled the moment she learned the truth. "I was at home when I heard the news on the radio. Atomic bomb, uranium, Oak Ridge." Suddenly, it all made sense. The secrecy, the security, the endless emphasis on precision. We had been separating uranium isotopes. Atom by atom, we had created the material for a weapon that could destroy an entire city. I felt sick, proud and sick simultaneously. Proud that our work had helped end the war, saved American lives, stopped the Japanese Empire. Sick that we had created something so destructive.
After the war ended, the Calutrons at Y-12 continued operating, but their days were numbered. Gaseous diffusion plants, which were more efficient and less expensive to operate, came online in 1945 and quickly became the preferred method for uranium enrichment. By 1947, most Calutrons had been shut down. The silver borrowed from the Treasury was carefully recovered. 99.99% of it was returned, with only tiny amounts lost to contamination or waste. The massive buildings at Y-12 were converted to other purposes. Oak Ridge transitioned from a secret city to a permanent town. The 75,000 workers who had flooded into Tennessee during the war dispersed, though many stayed, making Oak Ridge their home. General Leslie Groves, in his post-war memoir, reflected on Y-12's achievement. The Y-12 plant represented industrial audacity on a scale rarely attempted. We built the world's largest building to house the world's most sophisticated industrial process, employing workers who could not be told what they were building, using borrowed silver to create electromagnets, consuming more electricity than major cities, all to separate atoms that differed by just 1.26% in mass. That it worked, that we actually produced weapons-grade uranium in time to affect the war's outcome, remains one of the Manhattan Project's most remarkable achievements.
Ruth Huddleston, the Oak Ridge operator who described the psychological pressure of the work, lived to age 92. Before her death in 2012, she recorded an oral history for the Oak Ridge Heritage Museum. Her final reflections captured the complexity of the Oak Ridge experience. "I'm proud of what we accomplished. We helped end the war. We brought our soldiers home. Every time I met a veteran who had been preparing for the invasion of Japan, I felt grateful that our work at Oak Ridge made that invasion unnecessary. But I'm haunted by Hiroshima. I've seen the photographs, read the accounts, learned about the children who were vaporized, the people who died from radiation sickness. When I operated those control panels, adjusting dials and watching gauges, I never imagined that I was contributing to such destruction. If I could go back to 1943, knowing what I know now, would I still go to Oak Ridge? Would I still operate those Calutrons? I honestly don't know." The story of Y-12 is ultimately the story of individuals caught up in events larger than themselves. Gladys Owens, the farm girl who stepped off a bus into a secret city.
Helen Jernigan, watching gauges for 8 hours without knowing what they measured. Margaret Hinton, operating machinery she understood scientifically but not purposefully. These individuals and 75,000 others came to a Tennessee Valley and participated in one of history's most consequential industrial projects. They separated uranium-235 from uranium-238, atom by atom, isotope by isotope, until they had accumulated enough material to build a weapon that ended a war and began the nuclear age. They did this work without knowing what they were creating, without understanding the implications, without being able to consent in any meaningful way to what they were participating in. At Oak Ridge, in a secret city in Tennessee, ordinary Americans performed extraordinary work. They separated atoms. They created the material for weapons that changed history. And they did it without knowing what they were building.